All right, I will go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Gothic Symposium. Thank you for coming. I am going to introduce and welcome our Session B group, which is creative. So we're going to hear from a series of readers here. But on behalf of the symposium organizers, first, I want to you are here and also just touch on a few things before we get started. So first, have a symposium code of conduct that is available in our print program. It urges you to use participants' preferred nicknames, names, pronouns, etc., while in symposium spaces, just to keep it respectful. If you have any questions or concerns that arise during the symposium, if you're in person, we have volunteers and organizers all around. We're wearing stickers. If you are online, Alex is our online moderator today. There we go. So we have people here to help. We have built in plenty of breaks, but of course we understand if any of our participants need to step away during the session. We don't have a dedicated quiet room, but the library does have a reflection room if anyone should need it. It is room 2318. And that's the southeast corner of the second floor, which we are on. Nearest restrooms, we've got some over there, as well as up on the third floor, just to the left of the community room. There are vending machines on the first floor if anyone is feeling snackish. We also have some snacks back there. We also encourage all participants to use the hashtag Gothic Practice 2026 when posting about our symposium today. And as this symposium is focused, at least in part, on creative critical work, we invite all participants to engage with material both critically and creatively. We encourage artistic and other creation, as well as note-taking during all sessions. So it's my pleasure to introduce our creative writer today and presenter. And we have Gledis here who will be sharing some poetry for us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gledis, local community organizer, Wayne State alum. I have 4 poems for you today. The first is called Zombie. I witness your venom rotting you. Your poison infects from your body to your soul. The heedless words decaying your flesh till every limb displays its self-fulfilling damnation. The toxins plague the air with each syllable spewed from your mouth. Beauty might enchant your surface, but it erodes your voice. The path you lead denies solidarity and requires an audience. Allergic to mirrors, patronized by stares, they'll stab you in claims that they cried. Does your hate precede you? Do you expect it? I hope that it destroys you, so that you may find the chance to begin anew. But could you? So that was the first one. The next piece I have here is called The Abyss. I won't allow the whole you created to be accessible. It won't expand or consume. I claw at it, hoping for it to be a self-contained creature. Can't let them see its depths. I keep staring at it. So critically aware that it's there, I sit with her even now. The silence burns. I don't want to be consumed by her. She washes over me with no remorse. I shake with terror. There is nothing I can do. She keeps expanding. She gnashes at my bones. She pollutes my eyes. Everywhere I look, she is there. I cry. Then I sob. She stares back. My misery does not absolve me. She stares back. The next piece here is called Sober in Paris. The fleeting warmth in your eyes is a bitter combo with the lies that brought your smile. The walls you reside in create a complex prison that makes me question if you remember being free. Outside those walls, I see what you were before. Nostalgia, the mind killer. Does it count if I see you in me? Suddenly, I study your face as if it's the first time I've ever seen one. Dimples, handshakes, flailing hands, neuroticism. Is anyone else seeing this? I get overwhelmed with compassion, although not forgiveness. But Venus de Milo's hugs are a little too tight. Empty yet suffocating, they linger with intensity, clutching at a fleeting beauty that you know too well. I look just like you. And then my final poem is Savage Garden. You can take everything I've got, and with the last of my strength, I'll hold you. Because your benevolence is yours to bear, and weary souls need rest too. When the stakes are against you, as they often are, allow your black hole confessions to be safe with me. I'd still hold you. Forgive me if my grip is too tight. I'll forfeit nonchalance. A bruised bundle of sobs requires a kind pressure. Shaking, I'll still hold you. There's always been such pleasure in such a simple thing, being held. The tattoos of your warmth scar my skin as the veil between longing and bloodlust becomes thinner. I have no choice other than to hold you. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Thank you. Beautiful. Thank you, Gladys, for sharing. Next up, we have Richard. Richard Morgan is, oh, there we go.
Yes, yeah, there should be size of the material. Yes, it's in that one. Yeah, the Canva link is in that doc. When I need to change slides, should I just say next slide? Yeah, okay, cool. Alrighty, just let me know when.
Yeah, you are good. Okay. Oh yes. Oh yeah. Sorry. Wait. The one other very important thing for online people.
And shout out to Alex for taking care of the tech today. It's rough. It's rough work. Thanks, Matt.
All right. There we go.
Fine. All right. We good? All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Richard. I'm not an alcoholic. Just to start out, I realize this is kind of the creative section of things, and my initial configuration of this, I think it leaned a little bit more into creative stuff. I still think there's a rhetorical edge to it, but this is going to be a little bit more analytical than maybe I thought at first. I finished this at 10 o'clock last night, so bear with me here. So in Dr. Key's class, as mentioned earlier, we were tasked with conducting research into a haunted location here in Detroit. I think it might be better to say that Detroit itself is a fundamentally haunted city in a lot of ways, and that any so-called haunted location is just a matter of degrees, like the prominence of peaks in a mountain range. And I chose a location some of you are going to be familiar with. That's Detroit's Masonic Temple, down at the end of the Cass corridor. You've probably seen it, if nothing else. I remember when I first moved here as a kid, I first saw it after a Tigers game. I thought to myself, hey, what's the deal with that big spooky Gothic looking thing on the other side of the freeway? What's it doing in Detroit, Michigan? This is before Little Caesars Arena, before the municipal bankruptcy, before the Ilitch family said they were going to put up an entertainment district. They put up a parking lot instead. So it was very prominent, more than it was today, and it was really kind of eerie. It was like somebody kind of put up a castle in a ghost town. And it used to, like, literally, I had dreams about this place for a long time afterwards. And so when I had an alibi to do some research into it, I knew that I kind of had to. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about Detroit's Masonic Temple and its most notorious ghost story through the lens of Roland Barthes' mythologies. Sure, plenty of you already be familiar with Barthes and his work. I'm going to offer a brief summary, explain its relevance and how using a mythological framework can be useful in deciphering hauntings and haunted locations, especially in a city like Detroit. It's been fundamentally masticated by the process of myth making. You could apply this framework to pretty much any mythological object in the city of Detroit. The myth of the American automobile, the myth of the legendary Nain Rouge, the myth of the Detroit Lions, if you wanted to, and I have a lot of thoughts about that particular mythology if you ever want to talk ball. But since narratives of haunting are perhaps by their very nature mythological, I think it's particularly apt here. So to start, Barthes's concept of mythologies builds off of Saussure's notion of object language signification, that's to say, the relationship between the signifier, the signified, and the sign produced by way of the relationship between the two. This relation, of course, if you remember, composition classes in English, this is arbitrary. As Juliet once mused, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. But Barthes postulates that myth occurs at a second link in a new chain of signification, in which the sign becomes a new signifier, and the new signifier-signified relationship results in a myth. These myths, however, are not arbitrary. They're loaded with meaning. Per Barthes, the mythological signification is never arbitrary. It is always in part motivated and unavoidably contains some analogy. There is no myth without motivated form. Since our society is a bourgeois society, these myths tend to be bourgeois in nature. Myths furthermore do the work of rendering historical constructions as natural, even tautological. Also, per Barthes, the myth consumer takes the signification for a system of facts. Myth is read as a factual system, whereas it is but a semiological system. The mythological object, crucially, is emptied of its history. Myths furthermore do the work of smoothing out the contradictions inherent to capital, taking notions of meaning and making them common sense. The goal of the mythologist, according to Barthes, is to decipher these myths and thereby demystify them. So that's what I'm going to try to do with the temple today. Next slide, please. So what's the deal with the big spooky temple? If you want to know the facts, it was built between 1920 and 1926. The laying of the cornerstone in 1922 was a symbolic gesture. It was carried out with the trowel that George Washington, himself a Freemason, used to lay the cornerstone of the national capitol in Washington, D.C. Already we're getting literally baked into the foundation of this place. It's the largest Freemason building in the entire world. It's divided into 3 wings, the ritual tower, which according to the chief docent, stands at 17 stories tall. I clarify that because Google AI will tell you it's 14 stories, and I'm going to go with the Masons here. The auditorium wing, it's comprised of the Masonic Theater. That's a picture I took at an EDM concert a number of years ago. It's designed in a Phoenician Gothic style that emulates the Parisian Opera House. And then there's the Shrine Club, which I've never been in because it's reserved exclusively for Shriners, all of whom are Masons, though not all Masons are Shriners. There are levels to Masonry, apparently. In the 1920s, there were 63,000 active Masons in Detroit compared to about 2,500 today. The Masons have held a presence in the city since 1764, making them the second oldest organization in the city after St. Anne's Basilica. Masonry is highly symbolic by nature. They profess to take good men and make them better, file down the rough edges of man like a promising stone, and fashion them into something finer, much like the work of a stonemason, where historically it has its roots. In their lodge rooms, you might find a sculpture of a beehive meant to symbolize the virtue of industry. And they are, of course, a society of secrets. I think this is what we know Freemasons for, Illuminati, eyes wide shut, both in terms of rituals and their modes of identifications, like the secret handshakes, of which there are a few. One could easily pull off a mythological reading of the Masons themselves. Their age and their secrecy kind of lend themselves to it. Next slide, please. Nearly every public-facing surface in the temple is symbolic. If you pay close attention to the chandeliers, carvings, the friezes adorning the temple, you'll find King Solomon, Hiram, the king of Tyre, and the ever-present green man peeking out at you through the bronze as though it were foliage. Innumerable architectural styles can be found throughout the temple, from the medieval to the Romanesque, the aforementioned Phoenician Gothic, and the Neo-Gothic facade. And then there are the Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, Byzantine, and Egyptian lodges, just to name a few. This is incredibly ripe ground for myths to form. As Barthes observes, myth prefers to work with images where the meaning is already relieved of its fact and ready for signification, such as characters, pastiches, symbols, etc. No doubt the symbolism of all these surfaces were painstakingly contemplated by George Mason and Corrado Parducci, who designed the exterior and interior of the temple respectively. But it is this very propensity towards symbolism that makes the temple a place vulnerable for mythic appropriation. Next slide, please. Indeed, even before its final construction, the temple had already begun to occupy a mythic stance in the public consciousness here in Detroit, Michigan. For example, in the Detroit Times on November 18th, 1923, there's a picture there of a newspaper I scrounged out of the Detroit Public Library in the archive collection for this. There was a headline that shouted, "Masonic Temple, the city's Mount Shasta, awaits opening of new home week." So people were excited about the temple. Naturally, it seems normal. There's just one catch that makes this a really funky article. The writer, William Steiger, conducts an interview with the temple, and the temple responds in the first person. I guess they were just doing anything in journalism back then. They kind of still are. In this article, as in the title, the temple is explicitly compared to California's magnificent Mount Shasta, one of the crown jewels of the Cascade Mountain Range. The temple's attitude is both proud of its grandeur, yet deferential to the genius of its creators. It is also very explicitly identified with the spirit of Detroit, such as in the passage that ends the article reading, "That's the kind of a spirit that fits into what you call," in all caps, not all caps, but two capitalized letters, "dynamic Detroit." Every paper, every preacher, every businessman, every fraternal group, every church group working together, said the temple. I'm still not over that. With a final smile as the sun disappeared through Cass Park and left that great white mountain in the solemn splendor of its snow-white beauty and bulk silhouetted against the city light. Now, as kind of surreal as this article is, a couple things worth highlighting here. First, the temple meets the criteria for what Mark Eaton, who studied in Dr. Key's class, calls the collaborative process of impersoning, whereby paranormal investigators construct and sustain personhood status for the spirits that reportedly reside in haunted locations. Though in this case, the temple is both a haunted location and something of a spirit itself. Furthermore, there's an identification of the temple with the aspirational image of the city of Detroit in the 1920s. So to coordinate this with history, recall the United States at this time is in the middle of a veritable economic explosion. Money was overflowing both across the country and in the city of Detroit in particular. And because myths empty their signifiers of their history, note that in the public consciousness, the relationship to Freemasonry here is incidental, parenthetical to the fact. In this incarnation of the myth, this temple comes to signify something much larger, something that pertains to the city and its character. And we'll be working with newspapers a lot in this because the press has always been maybe the most fertile petri dish for the formation of myth. Now, the myth of the temple would signify more than just the spirit of the city. It would come to signify the very favor of God. In the Detroit Free Press, on the day after Thanksgiving, November 26, 1926, front page headline declared the grand opening of the temple. There's a huge parade, lots of bells and whistles, the whole shebang. We love parades here. An excerpt is included from the dedication address of Joseph Fort Newton, who proclaimed of the temple, quote, "It is a vision in stone, a dream come true, a prophecy fulfilled. For the glory of God and the good of man, we have uplifted a cathedral of Freemasonry, a temple of faith, philosophy, fellowship, and philanthropy." Nice assonance alliteration there. Stately in its proportions, noble in its appointments, and so finely poised that it seems almost to have come down from above instead of being built up from below. By coincidence, we meet on a national holy day. He's talking about Thanksgiving, right? That's just a day I argue with my family. When our country, on its knees, looks back upon the past with gratitude and forward into the future with faith, invoking the guidance of the God of our fathers. So here we see that very peculiar American myth, that of the prosperity gospel. The notion that material success is essential evidence of divine providence, that God blesses with plenty those who possess the mandate of heaven. But again, the myth is emptied of its history. And this variation of the myth, the affluence of Detroit, America more broadly, is the result of good old-fashioned ingenuity, the Protestant work ethic, and of course, the mighty hand of God. The material mechanisms through which wealth is produced are distorted. It also conveniently distorts the fact that a great deal of the money that came into the city during this time was the result of bootlegging. During the period of Prohibition, there were a lot of distilleries in Windsor, just across the border here, and Detroit was a staging ground for smuggling liquor into the United States. If you ever wonder why so many skyscrapers went up in the 1920s, that's why. But bourgeois society is much more comforted by thoughts of God's adoration and manifest destiny than it is by thoughts of bootleggers or conditions. But yeah, away. As I think we all know, our fortunes did not last terribly long after that parade. 3 years later, something called the Great Depression happened and everything just went to hell. So what happened in the myth of the temple? Well, as Barthes points out, there is no fixity in mythical concepts. They could come into being, alter, disintegrate, disappear completely. And it is precisely because they are historical that history can very easily suppress them. So in the 1930s, when it becomes abundantly clear that everything is bad and rapidly getting worse, it's no coincidence that the press coverage of the temple changes its tone to reflect the formation of a new myth. Found another article from the Detroit Free Press. It's dated for June 3rd, 1935. Smack in the middle. Things are really bad right now. Like the last article, also appeared on the front page. I guess this must have been a slow news day. However, this one covers the story of a 7-year-old girl, Frances Jackson, who wandered into the temple and got lost for 9 hours. And they found her in the middle of the night because someone heard screaming from out on the street. Once in, the story goes, trouble developed with doors. There were a great many of them. Frances went through them, but they just led to more doors and none to the street. It's about the first public mention I found of the temple as a labyrinth. And it's true, the temple contains over 1,000 rooms. If you don't know your way around it, it's very easy to get lost inside. And there may perhaps be no more apt metaphor for the transition from certainty in God's material providence in the 20s to the bewildering and terrifying uncertainty of capital's ultimate viability in the 30s than in the temple's transition from shining Mount Shasta to sinister, impenetrable, unnavigable labyrinth. Also, even though the temple isn't explicitly referred to as haunted in this article, it does mention that, quote, police detected as they carried the weary Frances from the Masonic temple. By the way, the police also got lost on the way out. That she seemed frightened by doors, particularly doors that closed behind them with the loud bang. Sounds like the start of a ghost story, if you ask me. It didn't take long for public perception of the temple to change from a source of inspiration to a sinister structure, and this accompanying change from a fascination from the temple's exterior to a terror at its interior further suggests a distrust of the inner workings of the city's symbols and institutions. Even this, though, functions to distort. The labyrinth remains something to be feared, something to be avoided, never to confront. There remains the insinuation that there are forces beyond your knowledge and comprehension, and you are better off avoiding them rather than attempting to plunge into the dark. So when does the temple become haunted? Or rather, when do people start saying it's haunted? That's kind of impossible to say. The earliest printed mention I can find of it in the Detroit Free Press is in 2009. It's actually from an article about the haunting of historic Fort Wayne, which we visited in Dr. Key's class and is really spooky. But one can see in the sidebar of this article a list of famous haunts that includes the temple. But even then, the story of its most notorious ghost isn't mentioned. Kathleen Tedson observes, quote, I don't know who is haunting the Masonic temple. I don't think anyone has investigated it. So you can assume pretty safely that the temple's reputation as haunted had probably solidified a good deal before this. But it's worth noting that this renewed interest in hauntings occurs in the wake of one of our more recent economic catastrophes, the Great Recession of the late 2000s. I should also point out that Detroit in particular was devastated by the consequences of the recession, and in 2013, the city would declare the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. And it's during this time that the first printed mentions of the principal ghost of the temple appear. Next slide, please. The most notorious ghost of the temple is none other than its chief architect, George D. Mason, who himself was a Freemason. I guess they were really literal back in the 20s. The villain could be anywhere. Actually, the scowling man who built the giant spooky castle. So apparently you can spot him to this day on the roof of the Ritual Tower. As the story goes, after the stock market of 1929, Mason, who was bankrupted, driven to financial ruin, and of course abandoned by his wife, ascended the tower and jumped, taking his own life. There is just one problem with this story. Mason died 19 years later in 1948 in the comfort of his own home, presumably surrounded by family, embodying the ars moriendi, or the good death. All it takes is a quick Google search to verify this information, and yet, much to the exasperation of the Freemasons, which was a very comical conversation I had with one of them, the tale persists. People continue to circulate it. it doesn't matter that it never happened, that this can't possibly be the real ghost of George Mason. Too many people have spoken it, and so a ghost has taken up residence at the top of the tower. You don't believe me? I asked a psychic. She did seances at the temple. She told me so. You could take it up with her if you don't like it. So she referred to Mason's ghost as a sort of false Mason, capital M there for the last name, not the organization. It's a malevolent presence created by people willing it into existence. If you've ever seen the 2020 film Host about a haunted Zoom call, similar sort of principle. So once again, the myth is emptied of its history. It signifies something else. So what is it? This year, the Masonic Temple will celebrate its 100th anniversary. 3 years from now, we will probably ignore the centennial anniversary of the Great Depression, maybe because we'll be in the middle of another. I hope not, but the economic turbulence of Detroit has always been a subject of myth. People's anxiety about the rise, fall, and alleged rise again of Detroit need comforting. People want stability. They want to know their work is going to be rewarded. They want to know that God will provide. But the story of Mason's ghost takes the very real, very material conditions that have induced incalculable suffering and distress in this city and distorts it into something like a Greek tragedy. Detroit's downfall, like the mythic downfall of its most curious building's architect, is rendered a consequence of hubris, a classic Icarian tale of man flying too close to the sun and burning up in the process. Mason's folly, per the myth, was that he aspired for more than what was rightfully his, and the city, by extension, was foolish to feign it could ever stand shoulder to shoulder with the likes of Chicago or New York. Mason's ghost is our ghost. There is also a lingering sense that these misfortunes which have plagued Detroit are always just around the corner. And as unemployment, cost of living, cost of gas, cost of healthcare, cost of everything rises, there's a creeping sense that though the city seems to be on the rise, we might just be approaching the top of the tower to our doom. And if we are truly Mason's ghosts, then we may have already fallen mere moments from the ground. And yet, merely to read myth is just to tacitly accept it. You have to do the work of deciphering it. As Bart says, the best weapon against myth is perhaps to mystify it in its turn, to produce an artificial myth, and this reconstituted myth will in fact be a mythology. Since myth robs language of something, why not rob a myth? So if the temple is a labyrinth, if the very appearance of reality under capital is confounding and twisting, turning, terrifying, disorienting, then turning away just isn't a valid option. You have to delve into it. You have to map the winding passages, the side rooms, the slamming doors, and the secret passageways and the dark, dingy corners. You have to light the way until it's no longer a mystery. And as with any monster, when you understand its weaknesses, it loses its power to terrify you. Then, and only then, can you make it into something else. I'd also like to just close real quick with, I asked the chief docent at the temple over there, his name is Rob Moore, really nice guy. I asked him, you ever seen any spooky stuff here in the temple? And he said no. But he has known a number of people who are not the kind of to make things up, who swear that they've experienced something strange. And I think what tires him is the idea that the so-called haunting at the temple is necessarily a dark or a negative or a scary thing. The way he put it, he classified it as a metaphysical presence. One of the only criteria for being a Mason, in addition to being a man, though he also clarified identifying as a man, and I was like, we got woke Masons before Grand Theft Auto 6. It's unbelievable. But the other one is you have to profess belief in a supreme being. You have to be spiritual in order to join the Masons. And the way he puts it is that this place meant a great deal to a lot of people in their lives. And could you imagine a more beautiful resting place? Next slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, wonderful. I should point out too, we are gonna do questions at the end. But first we'll get through all the presenters. So Jimmy, if you want to come up next.
No slides. Perfect. All analog. Makes my job easy.
How's this for volume? Can you hear me? Okay. Louder? All right, I'll try and project. Okay, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I love hearing all the presentations so far, so. The working title of this talk, is different than the program, so we might wanna, maybe we'll update it at some point, but the working title of this talk is Now Toward a Midwestern Gothic, and it attempts to examine my thesis manuscript for elements of the Gothic and Southern Gothic literary traditions in order to consider how they might also exhibit a Midwestern Gothic aesthetic. In doing so, one hope is that it might be possible, particularly in a place like Southeastern Michigan and the surrounding suburbs of Metro Detroit in the 21st century, for writers to adopt a quote, Midwestern Gothic practice. This practice, like its Gothic and Southern Gothic predecessors, would then serve as a way to challenge readily available narratives about the Midwest. For example, deindustrialization and the flight to the suburbs, and later the development of rural towns, like the one that I grew up in order to offer a more complex and accurate record of what living in the Midwest is truly like. In doing so, Midwest spaces can become as useful as medieval cathedrals and forgotten plantations, as overgrown swamplands and live oak trees, for expressing the ways that the Midwest is also always haunted by its own history. My thesis, titled Olivia and Orion, is a novella-length essay combining memoir, literary journalism, cultural criticism, and archival research on themes of collective memory, grief, and the art of survival in a small Midwestern town. The impetus for this project was an automobile accident that occurred on November 11th, 2013, and that resulted in the death of my friend Olivia during our senior year of high school, as well as the ways that I have struggled to understand her loss in the years since. For years, I have carried the weight of grief, but also the weight of a resentment at what I felt was the town's silence in the aftermath of Olivia's death. In this way, one of the preoccupations of my project is with silence itself, both individual and collective. Initially, the task of writing seemed to be to write into that void in order to reconstruct Olivia's memory, relying on my own recollections until those fell short and required other journalistic and archival research methods. As a result, I became interested in my own silence as well as Lake Orion's, the town where we grew up, and thus the project became a dual excavation of the self and of a community. This excavation took inspiration from Walter Benjamin, whose description of remembrance as a process of archaeology is perhaps immediately Gothic. In Berlin Chronicle, Benjamin writes, quote, "He who seeks to approach his own buried past must conduct himself like a man digging. He must not be afraid to return again and again to the same matter, for the matter itself is only a deposit, a stratum, which yields only to the most meticulous examination what constitutes the real treasure hidden within the earth, the images severed from all other associations that stand like precious fragments or torsos in a collector's gallery in the prosaic rooms of our later understanding." I like Walter Benjamin. It's nice. Like Benjamin, I dug for these images. The images are what remain, and I believe that these images can be useful symbols and aid in our understanding of Gothic, Southern Gothic, and in this case, a Midwestern Gothic literature. So like the Gothic novels, medieval ruins, and haunted corridors that signify decay in post-Enlightenment Europe, Southern Gothic literature adopted new symbols for its setting in the American South following the Civil War and the failure of Reconstruction, and later the socioeconomic hardships of the Great Depression. At the same time, Southern Gothic literature reacted against both contemporary Northern and Southern literatures of the time. The former embraced industrial scenes as symbols of progress, while the later romanticized the antebellum South. See also Henry Adams and the Virgin in the Dynamo, and thanks, Todd, for that reference. Instead, in the Southern Gothic, we find its symbols, much like the medieval ruins, seeking to dismantle this romanticization of slavery in the South pre-Civil War. These include derelict houses and forgotten, decaying plantations. As a Midwestern Gothic aesthetic, I'm interested in the ways that the land, perhaps even a whole town, can similarly take on this feeling of decay and become complicated when it holds both the desire to preserve its idyllic visions and its more complicated realities. So in this first passage from my thesis, I believe we get a sense of this desire to remember Lake Orion as a quintessential rural suburb, a vacation town for going, quote, up north, as well as a reality where part of upholding this vision requires a necessary forgetting of the tragedies that become part of the historical record of a place. So part one from my thesis, Olivia and Orion, goes like this. On the evening of November 11th, 2013, Olivia Spolyar made a series of phone calls requesting a ride home. Broken down, she planned to leave her Volkswagen Jetta temporarily until she could return the next day, and likely with a tow truck. Olivia, a 17-year-old senior at Ligorian High School, had spent the hours of dwindling daylight that Monday afternoon negotiating the limits of her blooming independence, visiting her boyfriend, an 18-year-old boy named Logan who lived in the next town over in Ortonville. To reach Ortonville, a neighboring town still lagging in its own suburban development, required coursing the winding back roads across Lake Orion, whose new subdivisions and cul-de-sacs eventually gave way to corn stalks, barren by late autumn, and divided every so often by rows of trees, each the same height, once planted to protect the crops from wind gusts. Weaving around the lakes, the two-lane roads rose with the telephone wires and fell to meet the wetlands. Larger homes surrounded stretches of shoreline, offset by smaller ranches tucked at the ends of unpaved trails and behind sagging picket fences, like tiny cabins of a gone age, pumping their chimneys above the tree line. Their exhaust combined with the snow clouds that were beginning to roll in under the cover of darkness. Beneath them, the smell of distant wood smoke and wet leaves. In the coming months, residents of both towns would fasten snowplows to the front bumpers of their pickup trucks, load their truck beds with rock salt, and begin the months-long process of digging themselves and their neighbors out from another deep winter piling. But while Olivia waited in her broken-down sedan, snowflakes had just begun to fall lightly, some pirouetting through the beams of her headlights, while others melted into tiny pools on the windshield. Logan answered her call first and set out following the same route as Olivia only moments prior, back toward Lake Orion. He easily agreed to pick her up and drive her in his Chevy Impala the rest of the way home to the house her family had moved into to be closer to the high school. The round trip would be of little inconvenience, a familiar route they had each made countless times before. Back then, those county roads became sacred spaces. Driving, or drifting rather, was one of the few harmless activities for restless youth. Most afternoons were spent this way, cars packed with teenagers driving to nowhere in particular, punctuated by the occasional stop for cups of diner coffee or trips to the Salvation Army with what little money could be earned from part-time jobs, all the while creating an internalized map of the limits of the known world. As Logan followed this map and drove to reach Olivia, his Impala's dashboard flashed an electric blue LED reminder for the first time that autumn. Ice possible. When Logan arrived, Olivia looked back at her beloved Jetta, parked along the shoulder of the road, locked its doors, and climbed into the Impala's passenger seat. The cabin provided a relief from the accumulation that had since picked up. Both of them were underdressed, in light jackets and ripped jeans, a uniform they'd wear as long as possible, opting for rebellious expression over seasonal preparedness. Though her long golden hair provided more insulation than his short, messy layers, her cheeks had become flushed pink. Olivia dropped her belongings, her school backpack, and a separate bag containing her camera and lenses in the back seat as Logan shifted into gear and pulled back out onto the road. Olivia remembered to update her parents with a text message, letting them know that she had gotten a ride home after all and would be home soon. The couple approached a four-way stop at the intersection of Seymour Lake and Sashabaw Roads, marked by the modest steeple of a white wooden Methodist church built just after the Civil War and over the foundation of a one-room schoolhouse. Along these roads, it was not uncommon for a line of cars to form patiently behind a tractor or to find oneself caught in the thick fumes of a square-bodied diesel Ford set on oversized tires. It was, however, rare for a vehicle to be free of a mud veneer up to the door handles. All dirt trails eventually emptied out onto Seymour Lake and Sashabaw, the intersection of which provided a brief buffer to the bends that seasoned drivers often took at high speed, joyriding, another local pastime. As the days had grown shorter, at nearly 8 o'clock, the stretch of pavement leading to the intersection was dimly lit by a single overhead streetlight. The headlights of Logan's car revealed gusts of snow and clashed with oncoming beams. He drove cautiously and began to brake well ahead of the intersection, but the Impala slid across the median and collided head-on with the Ford Focus. The sedan's plastic body cracked first, and then steel met steel. A deafening pop of the airbags silenced the shattering of glass so that shards scattered without sound. Then all motion ceased, aside from that of the snow, and fresh tire tracks appeared glossy red in the taillights of both wrecked vehicles. So, cool, thanks. No, thanks.
It's really beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So back to my Gothic practice, my Midwestern Gothic practice. When I try to picture William Faulkner's Yoknepatalfa County, the fictional Deep South setting to Faulkner's Southern Gothic novels, inspired by his own Lafayette County, Mississippi, I return to images of live oak trees and the twisted roots of mangroves, overhangs of Spanish moss, and boiling fields and swamplands. Perhaps these images come to me also from my own explorations and travels through the South, but nonetheless, I fixate on the trees as another example of a Gothic or Southern Gothic symbol. Robert Moore's 2026 book, In Trees and Exploration, explores a similar obsession. Moore considers some of the things that trees do, those that might offer insight into, quote, how we think in trees. For example, trees root. They also gnarl, both as verbs. As a guest on the World in Time podcast from Lapham's Quarterly, Moore describes this gnarling. He says, the tree is this living skin wrapped around a dead core. You have the skin of living wood that's being produced by the cambium, and it's growing outward and inward simultaneously. Like a series of Matryoshka dolls, each layer is encased within the next over time, which is why trees continue thickening. And that also leads to this mechanism that Robert Moore calls gnarling. Trees lock their errors in place. If a tree takes a strange turn, it can't straighten out its wood. There are ways in which our lives are like that as well. We can't choose to fix our past mistakes. We have to learn to grow beyond the past rather than hoping to travel back in time to make it something different. So that's Robert Moore. So borrowing from Moore's work, we might also consider how history itself is gnarled. And I think this is why the trees of the Deep South are a perfect symbol of the Southern Gothic literature. Again, resisting these rose-tinted visions of the antebellum period, Southern Gothic writers were interested in the ways in which the history of the South was complicated, often violent, and oppressive to offer an extremely generalized portrait. They also became interested in the mythology hidden in these wild and untamed landscapes, such as the folk magic and hoodoo practiced in the area that came as the result of the transatlantic slave trade. With this in mind, it is possible to consider the ways that the landscape of the Midwest is also haunted by its own history, saturated with its own mythical possibilities, and I believe that is also part of what constitutes a Midwestern Gothic aesthetic. So as I investigated the landscape of Lake Orion in my thesis, I unearthed its histories, which I felt were components of the silence that I became interested in. So this is my, I'll just read this one more section from my thesis. This is from part 3. So like, this is as I'm going out and kind of trying to locate Olivia's memory in my hometown. This is the more journalistic and kind of archival research part of my thesis. So part 3, Liquor Lotto Live Bait reads a signpost out front of a squat party store in Lake Orion and makes the imprint of the town's former history as a destination for going up north immediately obvious, as if these were the only 3 tenants to live by. The 3 L's become a variation of the equestrian 4 H's, quote, head, heart, hand, and health. In the summertime in Lake Orion, it's hard to imagine any other way of being, and this is most evident on any given weekend when boats tie up on Dollar Bay and partygoers leap from craft to craft, koozie in hand. Up north is uniquely Midwestern vernacular in the states surrounding the Great Lakes, Wisconsin and Minnesota, and especially in Michigan. One goes up north, meaning one takes a long weekend to a small cabin deep in the woods, where brothers and uncles gather to do more beer drinking than shooting during deer hunting season, or else to a charming yet uneasily sloped cottage whose siding becomes layered with mayflies by mid-June. For many years, my own family had one of these cottages on the shores of Lake Huron, and we went up north often. Depending on who you ask, up north has various interpretations. Our cottage in Port Sanilac, about a 2-hour journey up the thumb of the lower peninsula from Lake Orion, was certifiably up north back then, whereas real Yoopers of the upper peninsula, the UP, claim that you aren't really up north until you've crossed the Mackinac Bridge into Copper County proper, another 3 hours. New Canandaigua as Lake Orion was called originally, was at the time of its settlement certifiably up north to its first inhabitants who traveled 40 miles by rail up from Detroit to its remote wilderness and unspoiled shoreline. They found then the picturesque setting today that Upers claim is left to them alone, such that the town's name was changed to Orion in 1854 at the insistence of a Mr. Loren Treat, quote, because it was short, handy to write, and altogether lovely, it being the finest constellation in the heavens. Though I haven't lived there in many years, I often drive through Lake Orion, and when I do, I don't tell anyone that I'm coming. Instead, I drive around the places that I remember: a secret beach, the high school stadium where Friday nights border on religious observances, stretches of grass that have been cut through the woods, where giant power lines stretch on forever in either direction. In these places, the imprint has less to do with the town's history as a vacation destination. Instead, the tension between preservation and development is most apparent, recreating the way it felt to grow up in Lake Orion during the mid-2000s most of the time, caught in the in-between. Last year on one of these returns, I remember being struck by the natural beauty of Lake Orion in a way that I never had been in all the years that I grew up there. Taking a rounding bend of Clarkston Road on my right, I averted my eyes from the glare of the late afternoon sun reflecting off the water to find families of deer beginning to gather on the meadow on my left. And the whole scene became caught in one streaked and golden ray of light. Is this what Loren Treat pictured as life on one of the studs of the great Greek hunter's belts? From a real estate investment perspective, places like Lake Orion or anywhere up north around the Great Lakes region are a pretty safe bet. For all that the scenery has to offer, its sandy coastlines and fresh water, its acres of old growth forests and meadows, it carries none of the risk. Hurricanes of the eastern seaboard, earthquakes of the west, or the violent funnel cloud formations of the heartlands. The worst natural disaster that I can locate on record in Lake Orion pertains to a straight line windstorm in 2014 whose 70-mile-per-hour winds uprooted nearly 3,000 trees and knocked down 300 power lines, 15 telephone poles, and caused 36,000 residents to be without power until crews could turn the felled trees to timber and restore the lines. As a child, I remember losing power to wind from time to time, and the resulting hours spent outside out of boredom as only ever the most severe consequence. In the absence of any threat of real natural disaster, perhaps during the early years of Lake Orion's growth, the largest threat to man was man himself, he who likes to go bending the locale to meet his needs and economic interests. Today, the variety of architectural styles, commercial Italianate, Romanesque revival, modern, apparent in the buildings in the downtown village of Lake Orion, is not due to a local development committee's eclectic or kitschy taste, but rather due to a cluster of fires that afflicted the early town and where each burned down structure was rebuilt according to whatever was in vogue at the time. In developing Lake Orion, fires raged in 1859, 1862, 1874, 1894, 1902, and 1910. Each time, a combination of wooden structures and kerosene lamps was the suspected culprit. In those early years, the fire response system in Lake Orion included ringing a triangle from the belfry of a modest fire station, which at its alarm would prompt shop owners moonlighting as firefighters to join other town residents in a fire brigade line, passing pails from in-ground pumps and even the lake itself. It's no surprise that this often resulted in complete catastrophe. The downtown fire of 1862 was reportedly so disastrous that in 1863, Michigan State Legislature revoked the town's charter until its business district could be rebuilt. The amusement park on Park Island similarly closed to man-made disasters for good in 1955, years of the Great Depression and its own series of fires. Still, in 2004, a grease fire consumed Sagebrush Cantina on Broadway Street and its neighbors, including Broadway Records, that lost 20,000 vinyls while liquor bottles exploded behind the bar of the restaurant. It is curious to consider how Lake Orion owes its appearance on the one hand to its being the prototypical up north town, while on the other, the very nature of its downtown's uncoordinated brick buildings are indebted to a history of recurrent flames. That the landscape is naturally lovely and faces destruction as the loveliness becomes inhabited. I had wanted to find the exact dates of the fires, wanted to construct a history that connected instances of sea monster sightings. For context, Lake Orion's mascot is the dragons. People used to think there was a dragon on the lake. So sea monster sightings to moments where residents braved the threat of encountering said monster in order to face the more immediate predicament of blazing buildings. But these exact records do not exist. Recorded instances of the fires are reduced to only years. What is most curious of all, then, is learning that the fires themselves are responsible for destroying previous attempts to record their ever having happened. Just to close, I just want to say that the cathedrals of Lake Orion, my hometown in the Midwest, are two-story bungalows on shaded and tree-lined streets. Within them, there are their own trapdoors and secrets. There are no decaying plantations or mangrove trees in Lake Orion, but there are abandoned barns and forgotten hay bales left over every autumn. And there are paved two-lane roads, evidence of suburban development, but they also become paths that connect us to history so that we can better understand ourselves in the present. And I think that that's what a Midwestern Gothic practice can achieve. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
sure.
And now I'd like to invite Abby up, our last speaker, before we invite everyone back up for a Q&A.
Oh, it's not good, right? What's that? There's a couple right, yeah.
I got it.
Um. Yeah, if that would work for you, or I should be able to have them as well. I don't know if you can-
yeah, that works.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
oh,
you
yeah,
just
you
drop
can
it.
just put it on. You may sit.
Good to share. Yep, yep.
Okay. Hi. I am kind of going to talk through a creative practice that I did as a result of Dr. Key's class. It's maybe not as polished as the first couple, but basically, this is a story about a bit of a failure in the first part, but then through a Gothic practice, I was able to revise my ideas and come up with something that I was much happier with. So this is about the Gothic in comics, specifically comic books. And yes, it is a scary story about an overly ambitious project. Can you go next? Okay, so during the fall semester this last year, Dr. Key had a class called This Class is Haunted, where we were each looking at different haunted places around Detroit and, working on them throughout the semester. So I started with the place that I thought was like the most Gothic in the sense, which was Elmwood Cemetery here in Detroit. And I knew that I wanted to do something visual with that research because the Gothic architecture there and just the ornamentation was really evocative to me, and it felt the most Gothic out of all the scary or haunted places that we had to choose from. So I worked on Elmwood Cemetery, and I wasn't ever sure what I was going to do until I visited it and I saw the architecture for myself, but I also got the feeling of an extreme discomfort when I was there, not because I thought it was haunted, but because I knew I was there for haunted research when at the same time there were people there who were actively in the mourning process. So that discomfort led me to move a little bit away from a more serious approach to it and into a more fantastical or fictional version of it to work through my feelings about the ethics of ghost hunting and calling a place haunted. So, can you go to that? So, I also really wanted to talk about reality TV, which is a big way that places develop the reputation of being haunted. So I wanted to work through these problems and I knew I wanted to do them visually. So I started thinking about how to do that. And these three specifically were of interest to me. Ghost Hunters is kind of the proto reality TV show concerning ghosts. It's kind of like the one that started it all. Project Fear was not one that I was super familiar with, but something about their energy was very fascinating to me. And they have this whole thing about they had a ghost hunting van, and then they lost the ghost hunting van. And that idea really stuck with me. The idea that that this was like a commercialized thing that could go on the road and go to different spots and designate them as haunted. And then my personal favorite, BuzzFeed Unsolved, which is just a lifelong love of mine, which also takes a kind of a skeptical approach to haunted places. And then also something that came up during that class was that there don't seem to be any shows about ghost hunting led by women, which was something that stuck in the back of my mind and then showed up in my creative project, next slide, which ended up being a little comic about the ethics of ghost hunting and specifically the ethics of ghost hunting at a cemetery. So cemeteries in general are not like super popular places for ghost stories like in the real world because there are people actively mourning there. But I wanted to work with the idea that that somebody could take a place where something bad had happened and then turned it into this whole ghost story and then work through like my own feelings about that. So it started very personal, or inspired by personal events where my main character had to work on a project about a place and talk about ghost hunting. And then I wanted to do that for my full final project, and I quickly realized that I did not have the skill to do everything that I wanted to do. So I turned in what I had, and I called it good enough for the day, but I really liked these ideas and I really liked the idea of a visual comic to explore how the Gothic was showing up in Detroit. So I asked Dr. Key to continue working on this project through this winter semester, and I was able to do that with the help of some books, which kind of put Gothics in visuals and specifically visual storytelling mediums into perspective for me and explain kind of like how that works and how something becomes scary visually. So these were three of the books that I looked at, and they were the most impactful for me in like explaining how something gets a little creepy looking, and specifically how to incorporate that into a visual story. Next. So what I wanted to separate was the idea of like a Gothic story. So that's something, maybe like a Wuthering Heights, where there are all of these tropes in the story about things returning from the past, a lot of violence, or like ghosts, supernatural elements, versus a Gothic aesthetic. Originally, I was drawn to Elmwood because of the Gothic aesthetic, and then I was putting that aesthetic in a very not Gothic story. So I knew that I wanted the aesthetic to be evocative of the Gothic. So I had to figure out what that means and do that to the best of my ability. Next. So how do you get the shortcuts to a Gothic aesthetic? I looked at a lot of images, both my own from Elmwood and just like what people called the Gothic, and tried to figure out how to do that visually. And a lot of it came down to spires and triangles. So when you are designing something, you can have like a color palette, but you can also have a shape palette. So something that as I worked on this project longer, is I wanted to include more spires and triangles, because that to me and to a lot of like how we categorize the Gothic aesthetic seemed to be the quickest way to identify what I was going for. So next. This is a piece from the early 1800s, maybe 1700s, about the Gothic arch, which is another like image trope of the Gothic. And this artist drew an analogy between that and the frowning eyes of someone. It's also been like talked about as like a point to God, or like an evocation of like something up in the air that we can't identify. So this was also like in building the visuals of this, I really wanted to include this kind of shape and work from there. Can you go next? There's also Gothic lettering, which is kind of, you know, when you see it, it looks very old fashioned. It has the sharp points that that I thought were really important, and also has the serif, like the end points that give it an extra level of ornamentation. Next. And then just in general, like an abundance of of sharp pointy shapes and just like over ornamentation, layers of ornamentation, layers of like depth going inwards, and the even if it might not have a purpose, like figures and structures that are very visually interesting became a visual touch point for me. Yes. So I also looked at comic books, obviously. So I'll just go through these quickly. Some of the ones that I was looking for inspiration from, you've probably heard of Batman. He's pretty big. But there's specific ones that really lean into the Gothic aesthetic that do a lot with shadows and color blocking, where the lines are partly, it depends. So like in the first one, we have like a completely shadowed figure, but you can still figure it out based on the fact that they're in the forefront, and everything with lines and line art is in the back. And then in that photo on the side there, it has like an extreme sense of color blocking where there's not a ton of line art, especially when it comes to like the environment. Those were some things I was thinking about and bringing into it. Next, please. Another one I looked at was The Crow. That's a pretty famous Gothic comic. I think it was the viewing was yesterday, so I hope you're familiar with it. It is a Gothic story, and it has a Gothic aesthetic, and it has these great frames where there's like things blocking your view, things blocking the camera, and like adding an extra layer of shadows onto people. So like that middle one, that is the main character, and he's being seen through the railing of a stairway, which is like a completely like unnecessary choice, except that it adds like this layer of disconnection and discontinuity between like how the story is being presented and how you are reading it. And that bottom right one is a character being seen through a window, and then the lettering on the window is reflected on their face. It's really cool. And also the animal connections in The Crow. He has a connection to crows, obviously, and to cats, which is kind of another supernatural trope that I wanted to sprinkle in there. Next. Misty Comics, that's another one that I looked at. So this was a series of comics that they were anthologies, they weren't connected, but the main narrator character, Misty, she was kind of like the Gothic presence that introduced each one of these stories. And something I took from that was how the narrator and how the story was being framed was so like connected to the environment, and how you can see in these photos here, she kind of like comes from the environment and like bleeds into it in a way there's like no distinction between like where her hair ends and like where the clouds begin. So that was another visual thing I was looking at. This one. And then Swamp Thing, this is another comic I looked at. Some of the interesting things I found about it was that the panel sizes are additive to the story in ways beyond just like a regular square. So that one on the one on the left, it's a bird. That's crazy. It's a bird just because like that adds to the thematic like texture of the story. There's like there's not necessarily a reason for it to be in a different shape in terms of telling the like story in continuity, but it adds a thematic weight. So next. So then this was just a list of things that I had to add and figure out when I realized that I had not done a very good job my first time of creating this comic. So I had a lot more gray, I had a lot more shadows. I really leaned into the fragmentation that a comic book can provide, where the story is being told in little blocks and you move from one to the other. And sometimes there are missing blocks, sometimes it is not always clear which way that you're supposed to move through them. The mix of environment and figures, working with something like Elmwood, that is like one of the biggest green spaces in Detroit. So I knew I needed to do a good job of making that environment as Gothic as the architecture that it included. Added more triangles, obviously, and then I tried for panels and gutters, which is like the space between panels, to better utilize them. So next, please. So here, this one of the experiences that I had at Elmwood was that it was really loud, which I did not expect. There was a ton of lawn care going on while I was there, and I really didn't expect that because it is supposed to be a cemetery. It's supposed to be like a quiet place of reflection. But to keep it looking the way that it does, it requires a lot of manual labor and a lot of landscaping. So I included that as like the soundscape, and then the next panel is like that's supposed to be grass. So next. Then I also based off of my initial interest in reality TV and like how things become haunted, I included a lot of how me as a Gen Z person hears about anything, which is through the internet and through what people say on the internet. So my iteration on like panels or interesting panels was to do different web tabs and to show that as the way that someone would hear about a place being haunted. Up in the top left there, that was my iteration of the ghost hunters that represent the ethical quandary for my main character to go through. And then this was later on after I had done more research into like how the Gothic presents visually, and I think it looks a lot better. I leaned more into the grayscale and the things that I learned and talked through to give it a better spookier effect, to better represent my own ethical issues with ghost hunting. So, and then the last one is just what originally those were my original ideas, but I think it got even better through my practice, my Gothic practice of going through comic books and like seeing how it actually visually becomes Gothic. So that's it.
Thank you so much. So I think we can invite all of our speakers up here for a session. It'll be cozy.
Feel like we're about to have a mug shot.
Okay, everyone turn to the left. Does anyone have any questions?
Lemon.
Hi, I have a question. I'm sorry I didn't get the first presentation, so I don't have a question for you, but I do have a question for all three of you, separate questions. Jimmy, yours is still formulating, so. Richard, first question. You were talking a lot about like kind of in my perception, like the way that myths work, that's not exactly your phrasing, but I was wondering if you could expand on that. What are the like specificities of that about how does the collective?
Are you asking, sorry, my hearing is terrible. Just like how does a myth form exactly, or what that process looks like?
What is that? What is that?
As Bart's kind of explains it, a myth is like it's a kind of discourse, essentially. He in his book, the first part of it is just a series of like little 3-4 page essays, like dozens of them, where he'll look at the mythology of wrestling, the mythology of laundry detergent, the mythology of wine and French culture, and how these seemingly innocuous objects, they take on ideas of meaning that are kind of naturalized, essentially. The laundry detergent one is really interesting because he talks about how, if you look chemically at how laundry detergent actually works, it kind of separates, but in the formulation of the laundry detergent commercial, no, it's a purifying force. It burns things off. There's like violence in that. And like these discourses sort of form through like partial motivation, but it's not like, I don't think there's like a table of people gathered around in a circle smoking cigars, like, okay, well, what object can we turn into a myth today? But these discourses sort of spring up as ways of naturalizing historical constructions of meaning. And when you do that, the danger of it is when you present something as natural, it presents itself as beyond impeachment. And when you accept something as just natural, it kind of enervates your ability to criticize it or to challenge it, and you end up internalizing ideas about reality as natural when they are in fact historical. So the work there is to try to identify where that's taking place, sort of deconstruct the myth, and then in the process you demystify it. So I hope that answered your question.
No, that doesn't. I think part of the reason I was asking is I think you and I have had a lot of conversations about like material analysis versus like emotions and like the subconscious ones that inform that we say get a thing. And so I just wanted to hear your thoughts. Abby, my question for you, and this is a little bit more personal, but I come from a few people who can see ghosts, and I myself can't, and it's been a thing in my life where I'm like, I really feel that absence. And I really wish I could. And I'm just curious if you could you talked about the Gothic aesthetic, and you talked about the ethics of ghost hunting. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the aesthetic of ghost hunting.
The aesthetics of ghost hunting?
Yes.
Oh boy.
Based on what you've witnessed.
Oh boy. I think there was a great article we read in Dr. Key's class about the like all the different technology and like electronic toys that these ghost hunters will bring along as a way of like verifying what they're feeling. And in terms of reality TV shows, there's been like different waves of it. But they like each show kind of has like a couple of different tools that they rely on to prove something somewhere is haunted. And most of the time they are like a technology that like turns electromagnetic waves into words or something like that. So it's using like technology as like as a medium. Maybe it would have been in years before, or a seance would have like done that proof, but now it is like heavily reliant on technology that it like looks complicated, or it looks, electronic. It looks very mechanical as a way of like what's the word, of like making real the feelings that maybe a spooky, scary, haunted place or abandoned place makes you feel, and it's a way of like verifying that. And again, there's a lot of different reality TV shows about ghosts, so it kind of depends on which one. The YouTube kind of internet-based ones they're more like they tend to be like more sensational, and they tend to be like they pride themselves sometimes on having like a lower budget. So and also like there's an element of like usually like going to some place that is off limits, or at least the image of that. So somewhere I found like a cemetery where like you are allowed to go, but like you don't really go unless you have a reason to be there. Doesn't actually produce a lot of ghost stories because there's no like desire to really go there. It's not like off limits in the same way that like a scary hospital is off limits. So there's a wide variation in ghost hunting, and I find it really interesting. Some things that we looked at in Dr. Key's class like rely more on like the emotional like affect of like I feel like I'm being haunted, versus some rely a lot more on like a tough guy like going into a space and saying, actually I do think there's a ghost here. So there's been different waves of it and different like movements throughout the genre.
Definitely, I love that answer, and I loved how you kind of were connecting with the mechanical aspect and the unseen. I think that's a very interesting like version that emerges and goes through aspects of this. Jimmy, my last question. You were talking about the Midwest Gothic. Was that something you were thinking about as you were writing your thesis, or was it something that emerged later? Can you give us some insight into your writing process?
That's a good question, thanks. And um, I have two answers for you. I think first, no, I was not thinking about the Midwestern Gothic when I was writing my thesis. But also, I think I was always thinking about the Midwestern Gothic when I was writing my thesis. And that's something too that, when I was asked to do this, I wasn't quite sure. I've never thought of my work as Gothic. And to be honest, I didn't take the class with Dr. Key. I didn't really know a lot about it. So I just kind of began there with the question, like, what is this? I'm not sure. I liked some goth music in high school. Like I didn't know if there was a connection or not. So I didn't know. And I was looking for a way to kind of bridge the gap between like an idea of the Gothic practice and my own work. And then also in that line of thought, like in another mode, I'm like very interested in history and the South, the American South. And so I guess my reference point for anything Gothic was Southern Gothic literature. So that was a starting point for me. And just thinking about like how do we get from the Gothic to the Southern Gothic, and then what are the Southern Gothic writers doing, and how can I steal maybe what they're doing, or maybe I have already stolen what they've been doing in my own work. And the thing that stood out to me were the images and the symbols. And in that sense, then yes, I'm always thinking about a Midwestern Gothic. The other thing too about that is I was happy to arrive at this idea of my work as maybe being Midwestern Gothic because it kind of satisfies this longing inside me to be anywhere other than where I'm at, like a longing for the American South, which I don't live there, and for a time period that I don't belong to, but by having a kind of a Midwestern Gothic aesthetic, it kind of made me feel like I could approach the world around me through that lens and see symbols. Like this morning I was smoking a cigarette outside my house, and in my backyard my neighbors have a swing set that's kind of dilapidated, and I was thinking about how that might be sort of Gothic while I was out there. And so yeah, maybe maybe my Midwestern Gothic practice is another word for my depression, or it's like or it's just like a way of seeing the world, I think. And in that sense, I was happy to kind of find that in my own work, and I think it's something I'd be interested in pursuing further. So, yeah.
Definitely. I think like as creative writers specifically, there are a lot of like associations and sessions that we have. Even if we don't realize them, and it's really interesting in your answer that you were kind of like working with this like tip obsession that you didn't know about that emerged in your work.
Yeah.
And kind of creates like ghost of a theory. Or
Yeah. Yeah, I like that you said furtive obsession. That's like super interesting. Yeah, we could talk about it sure too. Thanks for your question.
Thank all of you guys. Those were all beautiful.
Speaking of all of you, we have a question from chat, from Cora, who asks, how do you all feel about critical theory how do you all feel the critical theory aspect informed your creative work? Pros, cons? Did you find the experiential research more helpful than the critical research? As a general question. And then also I would like to say, while you chew on that question, people in the back, if you can come up and address the owl with your question so the chat can also hear you, just that would be cool.
Must approach the bench.
Yeah.
Can you repeat it one more time?
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you all feel the critical theory aspect informed your creative work? Any pros or cons? Do you find the experiential research more helpful than the critical research?
I mean, I can start. I think they are both helpful in different ways. As much as criticism can tell you about like think about like why something exists, or think through like what it means on a whole scale. Sometimes you do have a personal response and experience that is different than what you've read about a place or about a phenomena. And I think that part of maybe my creative writing side more than my critical side is like to investigate that more or not brush that away, because that can be a place for either new critical work or just for like introspection. So I think that they're both helpful, and a critical approach to what you feel is not like, I think it can be additive to your critical process. Specifically, I think I'm seeing something about cemeteries in there. Like I'm not like I love ghost hunting shows. I don't really believe in ghosts, but when I went to the cemetery, I really didn't like it. And it's not because I thought it was particularly haunted, but you know, it was still like being around death. And I did think that that was kind of different than like being around ghosts or what people feel as ghosts. So that's something that I wanted to think about more. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll say, I feel like I'm coming at this reverse to like from kind of like the other side, which is like, I don't know, like Lemon's question, I don't know if critical theory impacted my writing process, but now having written it and seeing which ways I can maybe apply it to critical theory is super interesting to me. So I'd be interested in reading more about it and having a discussion with Dr. Duncan earlier today about this. Like we both kind of agreed, I think, that this just seems like really fertile ground and it's really interesting. So in that sense, no, it didn't inform my work, but I think it might inform my future questions about my work. Yeah.
I'll offer up a response. A lot of my, I guess we'll call it theoretical backing is primarily in structuralism, and in historical materialism and Marxism. So that's always kind of forming the backbone of how I look at something, how I try to frame it from the outset. It informs like the initial questions that I'm asking. But the experiential component, like when I was originally conducting this, some of the most fun that I had in this was like digging through an archive box in the Detroit Public Library and hand piecing newspapers together. Like I felt like I was about to end up like in a cold case file. Something like that. That a ghost was going to come down from the rafters and grab me, which would have been a little more sensational than what actually happened, where somebody said, "Sir, we're closing now. You have to leave." But the experiential stuff helps you fill in and feel out where the boundaries, where you're bumping into the edges of the structure are, and also kind of helps you think through, I guess, what the structure of the form actually is. I mean, even the temple itself is a remarkable expression of form, just in the sense that you have this huge and massive, imposing exterior. If you've seen it like from the street, there are way taller buildings in Detroit, but there's nothing that just kind of looms down on you like this one. But then trying to understand the internal structure of that is an interesting question too, because when I took a tour in there, and this is experiential, this place just whines and whines and whines on itself. They have passages that don't lead anywhere. They have false windows, so that from the outside it looks like there's a window aesthetically, and on the inside there's not. There's all these weird little tricks and things that I'll probably never get the full extent of, because I don't know if the Masons would ever accept me in there. Certainly not on just an investigative basis. That's not what they're about. And I don't know if I'm looking to join the Masons anytime soon. But like I guess to summarize, yeah, the theory stuff, I think, forms the initial thing, but the experience is where you really figure things out. And that's also in some ways more fun. It's like I tell people it's like the world's most boring treasure hunt. Like, because you're just digging through paper and dust and nonsense, but when you do find something, it's like you found crack in there somewhere, and it makes you want to keep going. Well, that's my answer.
Maybe you want
No.
But I have a question.
Okay.
Which is, one thing that struck me about the four poems kind of as a group was kind of the tension between holding on and letting go. And I was wondering if you could talk to that briefly.
Yeah, was there a particular one that, or you just meant like as a whole, like,
I mean,
was like
like they
kind of-
all, I mean, definitely like Savage Garden, but also Zombie, even like they all seem to have some element of.
Yeah, as I was going through, so I'm like currently working on publishing my own book and like what have you, and as I've been like writing, for this, I was like, okay, time to go through my archives and like I'm like, what is the most Gothic? And so, I tend to be just that kind of person, but like also when I was like looking at specifically things that, I feel like throughout my work being like haunted, it, is definitely definitely someone who's like haunted by their past, and everyone is, whatever. But that whole process of like actually healing and like processing and that kind of thing does to me have like a very Gothic element. And I love like exploring that. Some of these are things that it's like, okay, being haunted by someone who's completely alive and completely present in my life. Or just more of like an archetype of like a person. So like zombie was very much of like, okay, meeting someone who like maybe on the surface, I'm like, we're gonna get along because we be great, we have everything in common. And then I'm like, wow, you are the most awful, vile creature I've ever met in my entire life. I'm gonna write a poem about this. And so that's where I feel like it's, I think a lot of like processing and healing and being able to interpret things is that process of holding on and letting go.
I love the idea of healing as Gothic. That's awesome.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Can I-
You may approach.
Yeah,
May I
you may
approach the
yeah,
bench?
you may
Can we approach the owl?
Or just speak real loud.
Is this close enough?
Yeah.
My question is for Jimmy. I was really interested in your research about traditions of Southern Gothic and Midwestern Gothic, like being somebody who's lived in many regions of the US, including the American South and now the Midwest. So when I think of Midwestern Gothic and applying the traditions of Southern Gothic to the Midwest, I think about very much like Great Plains, very much rural farmland. And I know that you're writing about a rural town, and I'm familiar with the area too. I've told you my mother lives in Oxford, so I see like those traditions being applied to where you're from. But I'm also wondering, especially with what you were saying about noticing that swing set outside of your home, how do you see those traditions being applied more to an industrial area, a very much like Rust Belt area, somewhere like Detroit that is haunted by the history of like the rise and fall of prosperity, and it's very much like concrete, not so many trees, you know, how are you thinking about Midwestern Gothic in that sort of region?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm really interested in that. I was thinking about that earlier too. Like, is there a difference between rural Midwestern Gothic and like Rust Belt Gothic? I feel like Rust Belt Gothic could be a subgenre of Midwestern Gothic. Because there is that kind of, there's a difference between the rural farmlands, kind of that in the Southern Gothic tradition, you know, kind of like that expansive, kind of forgotten about landscape. And there's a difference between that and, like you said, like these kind of industrial spaces. I just want to reiterate again that Dr. Duncan told me about this work, The Education of Henry Adams. I believe is an 18th century novel that is not considered a Gothic text, but he goes to France, Henry Adams goes to France, rents a car, and he's trying to do research about the French cathedrals. And it's at the turn of the century, and he's thinking about this kind of tension between like what he calls the Virgin and the dynamo. The Virgin being kind of like this, which I think there's a similar tension in my thesis between like preservation and development. So the Virgin being kind of like these Gothic arches and these cathedrals from the, you know, like the medieval churches and stuff. And then there's, you know, the Industrial Revolution being the dynamo. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I am thinking about that. And I think if there were some sort of Rust Belt Gothic literature, maybe there would be some sort of similar tension between the Virgin and the dynamo, just like there is in the places that you and I both know between like preservation and development.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, everyone. We really enjoyed this. Yeah, thank you. So we are shifting now into our Gothic practice making activities. So we have some things planned for both online and in-person folks. Dr. Key is going to step in for the online activities. And then we have 2 tables set up in person for some in-person making activities. So that will be 3 until 4:30, and then we will take another meal break. Thank you all again. We really enjoyed your thesis.